Well, for this talk about fully integrated handlebars and failures, I just thought that'd be a good platform to have a talk about what are the different ways they could design these fully integrated handlebars and what are different brands doing and putting on these new latest top-end bikes that they're bringing out. So let's roll an intro and let's get into it. Now, as a manufacturer, you could have three design options to start off with. What you could do is you could put all of the cables outside of the fork stem, you could put all of the cables inside the fork stem, and you could put a combination of some outside the fork stem and some inside the fork stem. Now, we know that the SR7, if you haven't checked out GC Performance, he's actually done a really good video on how he's done the new upgrade for the recall, and you can see exactly how it's designed. So that's a really good video to go and watch to get an idea of how Specialized have tackled this fully integrated handlebar system and how they've run all of the cables outside of the fork stem. But there is other designs, and there's different ways of doing that, even with the cables outside the stem. Now with the SR7, you have basically a puck which has got holes in it that they're put through. The Scott RC also does the same deal, and then you also have some brands that are using a D fork, which is like the Colnago system, where at the top bearing, it's a D shape, and then it chamfers off to a round section at the bottom, so the cables then can slide down in that gap between the bearing and the fork. Or you could use something like the FSA design, where they run some of the cables outside of the fork and one of the cables inside the fork. But you could also opt to run all of the cables down the fork, but I'm not aware of any brand that's actually doing that currently. Now, the two compromises between using the cables outside of the fork, the argument between the D section type and the puck with the holes in type, is that when you use the puck type, you not having the bearing in intimate contact with the fork. You've got a puck in there, and you may even have a retaining disc or compression disc or compression washer like they've got on the Specialized system. And what this does is there's some moment there between where the bearing is and the actual fork, and you just got some sort of spacer in there. So if there's a slight movement, then that can actually have a micro movement at the fork point where this puck or this washer is in contact, which then can start the stem or marking in the stem. Now, carbon doesn't like scour. It's like when you get a tile. If you get a tile, you can cut a tile because you scour it, and that provides a weak spot. When you put force on it, it breaks. Carbon, it's the same thing. So I personally do prefer the D-shaped design, but then the compromise with the D-shaped design is that you only have a half or a 3/4 radius of that circle in contact with the bearing because you've got a space on it. You could actually make the D section and have a half D-shaped section that you add into the other side of that D section as basically a washer that fits into that space that the cables run through. So you'd run the cables through the D section, then you put that in place, and then you'd have full contact with the bearing. So you could also do that. Now, the other option is you can run some of the cables outside of the fork and some of the cables inside the fork, and this is basically the FSA design, or what they call it, full speed ahead, which is part of the SFA model line. And what they've done is they've run two of the cables outside of the stem and one inside the stem. And the advantage of this is that then you can turn the steering wheel and it has no effect on the cables. You can turn them completely, and you're not going to get any creasing or crimping or anything of those cables that are going through the stem. So that's an advantage of the SFA. But then that makes it a little bit more complicated, or makes the stem point higher, because you actually then have to allow space for the cable to go into the top of the fork. Now the final option you could do, which I'm not too sure if any of the brands are doing this, is run all of the cables down the top of the fork, so they're all inside the fork, and then you would have a Dremeled hole in the fork, like the Specialized do, and then you would run the front brake straight down, and then you'd run the cables that go into the frame out of that point. And normally it's quite spacious above the bottom bearing, so there'd be enough room for there to get sufficient turning on the front steering. So that's another option you could do. And I like that option, because then the fork and the bearings are using the old type of design that we're very familiar with, and we know that's very reliable, where the fork is in intimate contact for the full 360 interface with the bearings. So there's no spaces, there's no D-section that's half fitting in, you have full intimate contact. And we know as long as the system has not got any slop in or any movement in the headset, that this system works pretty reliable. Now if it was me and I was working for a bicycle company and I had to choose a design that I was going to go with, I would either go with all of the cables going down the top of the fork stem, or I'd go for the D-section design. I'd either pick one of those two, or maybe a combination of those two, because I'm not a big fan of spacing out the fork interface to the bearing. So the fork is not in intimate contact with the bearing, it's just either got a pressure washer or a puck that fits in there, and then you have the bearing. And to me, this is shown to be the weak spot when there's a failure. That part there breaks off, and it's because the scouring occurs at that point. Even with the older system, if you had a loose headset, then the bearing would wear out the carbon, that's where it would fail. That's where we've had most of the problems with the fork and headset design. So what I would do is that I would go with the D section, where the fork with probably a spacer. I'd like to use a D section spacer that goes in there, so then you have full contact and have that in full contact with the bearing, and then I would have a spacer down below where the cables could come out. Well, you wouldn't need to with the D section, but if I went into the top, then I'd have a hole down in the middle of the fork where they come out. I'd use one of those two designs. Now, on my fork bike, that doesn't run a fork plug at the top. What they've done is they've made the fork of a thicker material, and to lock it into the top bearing, they actually have a pin that you put in on the side of the frame. There's two little plastic covers that you can pull out, and then there's a pin put in there, and that pin is knocked in, and that was actually holds the whole thing in place. So there can be no stuffing it up, pretty much, unless the manufacturers have made it incorrectly. There's none of this setting it up and, you know, putting the wheel down and making sure it's tight and there's no movement but it's not too tight, which is kind of the human factor that comes into it. So that's what I would do. I would use that sort of system where when it's going out to the bike shop and they're going to build these things, as a manufacturer, I would make it pretty much foolproof, so I wouldn't have to worry about the way it was installed, because these fully integrated headset systems, really, we are in some way compromising the system. We're either putting a hole in the fork somewhere, or we're making a D shape where it has not full contact with the bearing, or we're putting a puck in there where it's actually levered away from the bearing, so there's a possibility of movement. And movement is obviously what we've had a problem with the Specialized. And I don't think this is really, I mean, we're pointing the finger at Specialized, but I wouldn't be surprised if this sort of problem comes up with other designs that use a similar type of system to transition the cables down into the fork and into the frame. Well, anyway, guys, before I go, there's just one more thing I want to mention. With these fully integrated systems, you really want to keep away from mechanicals, because with those sorts of tight turns and movements going through the frame, it really is going to compromise your steering. I mean, I've had bikes in the past that have had, how would you say, tortuous paths the way they go into the frames, and the mechanicals just don't work properly. You've got to have a nice flowing cable for the mechanicals to work properly, and external cables on the frame is even better. I know they went internal frames and they've gone to this fully integrated system, but for mechanical systems, the less tubing you have them in, the bigger the radius, the better they work. Well, anyway, guys, that's where I'm going to leave it for this video, and I'm going to catch you next time. Cheers.
Yeah.